We're going to stay with the conflict then between Israel and Gaza now for our perspective segment. And for that, Michael Shurkin joins me on set. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the director of global programs at business advisory firm 14 North. Thank you very much for joining us, Michael. So Antony Blinken then is, of course, en route to the Middle East now. He'll start with a visit to Israel. And one of the goals, of course, is to prevent the conflict from spreading beyond Israel and Gaza. Do you think that the U.S. can make any difference at all in the way that the rest of this conflict plays out?
It's a great question. I think possibly yes, primarily by signaling to Hezbollah and to Iran that they really should stay out of this. And I think that's the critical thing. And I think that's the main reason why the aircraft carrier group was sent, is just to send the message that this needs to be a limited thing. This needs to be between Israel and Hamas, and just everybody needs to stay out. Because if they were to get involved, Iran and Hezbollah, then this by definition becomes a much more serious conflict, and a whole lot more people will die.
Prior to Saturday's brutal attacks in southern Israel, Joe Biden, I think you could say, had a complicated relationship with Netanyahu, to say the least, as the Democratic president before him, Barack Obama. But this week, we also saw him deliver some of the most supportive statements of Israel yet, some even in Israeli media saying that he seemed even more supportive than their own prime minister. Does this mean that moving forward, any disagreements between Biden and Netanyahu, between Democrats and Netanyahu on a larger scale, will be ignored?
The thing is, there's a difference between the personal relationship between the two men, and then some issues are just larger and more important. So I think there's a question of dealing with the emergency and dealing with the war, and then later there's a question of moving forward, what happens. I mean, already people are saying, Israelis are saying that there's going to be a real reckoning after this, because it's clear that the current government has completely failed in a gigantic way. So that will have to happen, but at the moment it's sort of the sense is that has to happen later, not now.
Speaking of some of those gigantic failures, Israeli media, amongst others, has quite a bit of coverage really on how Netanyahu has consistently kind of elevated Hamas in the past in order to avoid the rise of other Palestinian groups that would make it more likely that a peace deal would be signed or even that a Palestinian state could emerge. So is supporting Netanyahu now somewhat counterproductive? I mean, I understand that right now the priority is to respond to these attacks, but looking forward towards the long term, given that so many in Israel are saying that, he in some ways is responsible for what we see, for the increase in violence in recent years, is it not counterproductive? Is this not the continuance of policy failures?
It's a policy failure, but I entirely reject the idea that Netanyahu is in any way responsible for this mess. Hamas is what Hamas has always been, and ever since the beginning, well before Netanyahu came into power, Hamas had set out on a genocidal mission to rid the Islamic land of Palestine of their Jewish presence. Hamas is not interested in a two-state solution. They're not interested in peace. They're not interested in liberating the occupied territories because, for their point of view, the entire country is occupied. So they don't actually recognize these borders. I mean, in terms of past mistakes, yes, a lot of Israeli governments have made mistakes. I think the comparison is, I mean, clearly any war is a tragedy, but tragedy, the Greeks taught us, is always the result of choices that people make. But the problem is that one can say that, okay, mistakes were made in the past, so therefore, does that excuse things? Does that make it seem like, well, you can contextualize and there's, all sorts of reasons, so therefore, we really shouldn't do anything. It doesn't minimize the fact that Hamas is what it is. Hamas has been doing this for a very long time. It was Hamas that sabotaged the Oslo peace process in the 1990s with its suicide bus bombing campaign. It is what it is. And right now, Hamas absolutely has to be dealt with. But it is true that, of course, it takes two to tango in the sense that a lot of mistakes have been made. So I think it's in the sense of the problem has to be dealt with now. Then, of course, there has to be a reckoning, and that reckoning has to be, and I think the Israelis are going to be doing this, basically thinking very hard about, well, our policies of the last 20 years haven't gotten us anywhere, so how can we come up with better policies? And there will absolutely be a vociferous debate in Israel about this, and that will be a very healthy debate. And I'm very certain that Netanyahu is not going to emerge from these debates unscathed. I mean, I recall the damage done to Golda Meir with the Yom Kippur War, where because she also decided that there wasn't an immediate threat, so this destroyed her political career afterwards. And I think something very similar is going to happen now.
There's been a lot of criticism about the airstrikes that have been carried out thus far, the death of civilians. What do you think comes next? Is is a ground invasion, is the kind of relentless bombing of Gaza the only solution possible?
Well, I'm critical of bombing because I don't think they're particularly effective. But I think that a ground operation is absolutely inevitable and is going to be vicious. But that is really the only way that this can be done. There's really no way to square these two things. If we are concerned about humanitarian causes, then I would really think that the responsibility is entirely on the shoulders of Hamas. I mean, if you pick a fight in this way and then you're counterpunched, I don't think you have a right to complain about the counterpunch. And this just demonstrates the cynicism of Hamas, the fact that they are willing to expose the people of Gaza to this kind of violence. And they did it deliberately. I mean, they knew that this was going to happen, and they did it anyways, which means that it was their choice. They absolutely knew that their own people were going to suffer. But that's their strategy. And I think that Hamas has always hoped that if they can make their own people suffer enough, then this will create enough international pressure that the international community will somehow ride in and give them what they want. And what they want, as I've said, is not peace. It's not a two-state solution. It's not some sort of liberal binational unitary state. It is a Islamic land rid of a Jewish presence. It's ultimately about religious bigotry, which is why I find shocking that a lot of people, particularly on the left, progressives, so-called, rally to the side of Hamas, because they're ultimately rallying to a group that's motivated by religious bigotry, hatred, anti-Semitism. They do not want peace. They do not want to govern. They do not want to take care of the welfare of their own people. In fact, they're willing to offer up their people as sort of a sacrifice, hoping that that news outlets like France 24 are going to swoop in and they're going to cover all sort of the horrors of it. And this will sway public opinion.
Michael Shurkin, I'm so sorry to cut you short. That's all we have time for, but thank you very much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure.